Welcome, everyone, to the Illuminate CISO panel on security for modern applications. I'm Dave Frampton, General Manager of the security business at Sumo Logic, and we're very fortunate today to be joined by two thought leaders in the industry, Yaron Levi, CISO for Dolby, and Tyson Martin, member of the CISO group at AWS. I'll ask these guys to introduce themselves just briefly, and then we'll jump right in and hopefully have a good interactive discussion on challenges and opportunities, really, of securing this new threat surface for the modern enterprise. So, Tyson, how about let's start with you? Brief intro, if you could.
Yeah, you bet. My name's Tyson Martin. I get the privilege of being a member at AWS, connecting with customers, advising customers on strategy creation and execution across all levels in the cybersecurity space. Working with product teams and evolving products and services at AWS, and then combining those, right? Taking the pulse of CISOs and CIOs and desired business outcomes, incorporating them back into the way that our products shape up and how they match and satisfy the needs of organizations.
Oh, fantastic. That'll be great. That diversity of input you get from all the CISOs and their organizations will be great insight to share with the audience in the panel. Yaron?
I'm Yaron Levi. I'm the CISO for Dolby. It's my second CISO role. Been practicing security for the last about 15 years or so. Prior to Dolby, I was the CISO for Blue Cross Blue Shield here in Kansas City, and also worked across different industries. I worked in healthcare. I worked in financial services. I worked in e-commerce. I was a security architect for eBay, which was one of the most fun jobs I ever had. And I also one of the research fellows for the Cloud Security Alliance. So if you ever had to run through a CIQ or Cloud Controls Matrix, or actually had to deal with the security enterprise architectures, also the cloud enterprise architecture from the CCM, yeah, you can be angry at me for that. So
well, and I love that diversity of background, everything from eBay, obviously, a modern type business from its genesis to traditional Blue Cross, and then now at Dolby, a heavy engineering culture. So I think this is going to be great to have your perspective. So as we get this kicked off, we talked about people, process, and tech, and we'll sort of walk through that in terms of the different dimensions of this problem of securing the new threat surface of modern applications built natively in the cloud as part of digital transformation, creating digital experiences. But before we get into those questions, which are pretty centered on the how and the what, let's talk a little bit about the why, which is the relative priority of securing these modern applications, the priority of this threat surface relative to the priority of what most people think of as more traditional threats that the enterprise faces, say, ransomware, phishing, and the like, and how CISOs are thinking about, the relative priority and the relative investments that they need to make to ensure themselves against both of those risks. Yaron, maybe we can start with you.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, so it's a fantastic question. I think, one of the things that we all recognize that over the last, few years, it's not just last 2 years of the pandemic, but over the last, 10 or plus years, we see a shift. We see a big shift with the move to cloud. When we think about companies, I think we can argue that almost every organization these days is a software company. If you're just a small retailer, you still probably have a small development arm or software that you're using, right? So I can remember who said, but software is eating the world, basically. We see more and more of that, and that's accelerating, and it's moving very, very quickly. The speed of innovation. We're seeing more and more organizations adopting new technologies, different third parties, SaaS and various cloud applications, open source tools, et cetera, et cetera. So all of that is accelerating, on one hand, the business opportunity and the agility and everything else that we're able to provide to the world. On the flip side of that, it's also creating more technical debt. It's creating a larger attack surface. It's creating other challenges that we need to think about. And if in the past security was predominantly focused around securing the enterprise, now we have to think about security on a much, much broader scale of securing everything, pretty much, right? Everything that we are dealing with. And then, I mean, on top of that, I mean, obviously, I mean, you can throw into that what we've seen over the last couple of years. We have the massive shift to hybrid workforce. Companies are becoming more and more decentralized. We're using resources, across the globe. There's also shifts that we're seeing on a global scale, on a global level, that are impacting us that we have to think about. So all of that, I mean, security is definitely expanding from just being, okay, I'm just managing the firewalls or just managing, my enterprise, to much more of a strategic function across enabling the
Yeah,
business.
that makes total sense. I like this idea that you can almost think about, securing the enterprise. Software will become the enterprise. So to some extent, the relative priority of this, I mean, it just almost fuses together into one single, unified fabric that you need for the defense. That's great. Tyson, how about from your perspective in the CISOs that you interact with? How do they think about the relative priority and the rate of this transition to these other attack surfaces associated with these modern applications?
Yeah, I think what the pulse of the CISO today is really becoming a pulse that realizes that um, if organizationally you don't have um, buy-in and connection with the needs of your business, and you mentioned the why, right? So that if you don't start with the why of the business and then connect what your strategy is to protect that why and to enable that why, that the faster we move and the more we enable that is cloud facing, which is innately different level of risk, the more that falls apart, right? The less buy-in we have from our partners across the business, the more they want to move fast and possibly move with not as much care and due diligence as you would like. And you become it's easier for a relationship to become adversarial, and then to be working against each other instead of working with one another in a manner where you're amplifying each of your strengths and the value that you can bring to the organization, which then helps you to increase, your ability to innovate, your ability to satisfy, increase and improve customer experiences, profitability. Those types of things are lacking. And so I think it's a blessing that can lead to a curse if the foundation isn't solid to begin with. So you need to go back and ensure that that's in place, good governance, and good alignment with what your desired business outcomes are and their risk tolerance.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Both of you, in a way, challenging the premise of the questions. I love this panel. Your nugget in there that I really resonated with was the question was, how does the CISO think about the relative priority of these things? And your point is, it actually is equally important, if not more important, is what's the level of buy-in from the business owner of that application? What's their opinion on that matter and the relative priority and their degree of buy-in in it, which I think is a great dimension. It's a great transition also maybe into the people part of this, because you've already introduced, hey, we have this community that is building these applications very close to it, DevOps teams, application developers, SREs, this sort of constituency, and then you have kind of the more traditional sort of SecOps type of resources. And from a people perspective, as these groups try to start collaborating together, right, to learn from each other, to execute workflows efficiently, what are some of the do's and don'ts, the offense, the defense, however you would sort of frame it in your own words? What are some learnings along the journey that have been expressed to you as both CISOs and, as you point out, line of business owners have started this collaboration to protect this new attack surface? Tyson, maybe just bridging off of your last answer, maybe you could start us off on this one.
Yeah. So from a people perspective, I think it's very natural in an organization for a CISO to see that as the members of the CISO's team as their team, right? Then the members of the CIO's team as their team, the members of the head of development as the developers team, and then their goals are their goals, right? When we look at people, we don't make change in people with technology alone, right? What I see as being successful right now is when CISOs collaborate and align their goals with the goals of other teams, and then they use the collective strength of, it's like two oxen that are yoked together. What they can pull for a weight is greater than one oxen, just two oxen separately can
Right.
pull,
Right.
right? So it's that establishment of processes, policies, procedures, the culture in the organization, a culture of understanding there's a lot of priorities and a lot of things that people want to accomplish. But if we do really prioritize and we align together, we get this magic extra boost of energy or accomplishments because of such.
That's great. And Yaron, maybe if you could pick it up with that idea of culture and synergy, and then also maybe we've talked a lot about kind of the CISO level, but if you sort of take the perspective of a DevOps engineer or a security engineer or security analyst, maybe share learnings kind of managing and building those teams as you have for years in different organizations.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love what Tyson said about culture, and there's a lot of things to unpack here. And I hope I'm not starting a religious war or a religious debate here, but it was previously in many organizations, you almost like see the divide. We have the IT team and we have the engineering team, and they don't mix, and they sometimes don't talk to each other. And oftentimes you see organizations where the engineering is part of like the new and cool, and IT is considered part of like, okay, the old and plumbing and laptops or whatnot, right? But the reality is like Tyson said, we're all in this together, and we're all enabling that together. And I think we need to move from, I would say, siloed teams or siloed approach where you see in a lot of organizations, if I kind of reflect back, throughout my career, to more of building those communities. And we see those communities, across the industry, and we see a lot of people coming from various companies, to collaborate, to share knowledge, to share information. Tyson, I love what he does with his role. I mean, talking to different clients, helping with strategies, providing the perspective, from across the board. This is ultimately we have to do it within our own organizations too. So how do we build that community? How do we recognize and realize that there are differences in mindsets? I remember talking to one engineer several years ago, and he said, we as engineers, we wired to build stuff. It's like artists, it's like creators. You guys are wired just to break stuff. And how do we align that, and how we align that conversation? So I think we need to have a lot of empathy for each other and understanding where we're coming from, understanding that ultimately we're driving towards the same goal. And we both have room within that same community when we can leverage our strengths. And this is something where I see a lot of organizations still kind of struggle, to how to do. And where I see that most of often is when you think about the nature of like whether security is centralized or decentralized. Maybe the traditional models where like security is very much centralized, everything has to go through security has to approve everything. But we are seeing that, the model can scale and can move potentially as fast as like maybe the business wants. On the flip side, we're seeing organizations that decentralize everything and they end up in chaos and actually not doing security and things like that. So how do we build a model where, yes, some functions are centralized, some functions are decentralized, but ultimately there's a concert that works together and there's overall governance on top of that. If you're an engineer and you develop software, I expect you to know secure coding best practices. I expect you to test your code for vulnerabilities, review your code for security issues, no different than you're doing unit testing. I expect you to scan your code, etc. On the flip side, I don't expect every developer, every engineer to be an incident responder, and so on. So I think it's going to be different for every organization, but the conversation needs to happen. What makes sense for our organizations to centralize some functions, and we can gain potentially the power of the scale and the share between the groups, and what decentralize and push closer to to development lines to gain like the most benefit for what we're trying to do.
Yeah, that sweet spot is the art that and the opportunity for everybody to try to find. This is a great bridge into the process part of it, because you've introduced I think part of this application lifecycle, because to assess whether the application is fundamentally secure, you have to trace all the way through. You mentioned the build phase, right? You're talking about, code scanning and application security testing, that sort of thing. Then you sort of flow in the deploy phase, and things like posture management come into the fold, and then get into the run phase. And now we're thinking about, technologies like cloud workload protection, right? The old web app firewall, right? I mean, there's this entire life cycle, and I think, many of the people in the audience are sort of at various stages in the journey of shifting left and trying to sort of build bridges across the three phases. And so maybe just from that perspective, Yaron, you can pick this one up and then pitch back to Tyson from sort of a process and workflow. What are ways that teams can help streamline that into a horizontal coordinated process? And then maybe what are some pitfalls to avoid, given that that's their goal?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there are several things we need to recognize. First and foremost is that the environments that we are operating in are getting more and more complex. Different technologies, different types of services. I don't know any two companies that are alike, right? I mean, you think about, I'm going to date myself here, but back in the day, companies I used to work for, we had maybe like one or two programming languages, and we always argued like, do we need to buy a tool to cover this language or that language? I mean, now almost every month you hear about like a new flavor of JavaScript that I never heard of before, and they're all different, and so on, right? So it's accelerating. It's a complex environment, and you put on top of that, the open source community. Again, there's a lot of variance there. So I think what we need to recognize is several things. One is we need to have, regardless of the technology and what you're using, from a process perspective, we need to have clear guidelines and policies that are common across the board. And that's that's kind of the first thing. And I think in many cases I don't see that in many organizations. I think there's also a shift in mindset. Again, we talked a little earlier about the centralized versus decentralized model. How does that impact the process? I don't want to be in a situation where somebody develops something, throw it over the fence, to the security team to whatever, do with it, and then throw it back over the fence. That doesn't work. I mean, we have to be aligned, with the process. And then, how do we enable, those different things? So, for example, we need to recognize that, in order for us to enable the dev teams and the engineering teams and the business to continue and operate faster, maybe there are some cases where we don't need to put all the friction on top of that and let the business experiment and do different things. But create an environment that, okay, maybe it's isolated. You don't have all the controls. You don't have everything you need in there for what the security policy requires. But you can experiment, do whatever you want. And then worst case scenario, if you blow up, you're just going to blow up this little environment as opposed to impact the entire organization. So we have ways, to slice and dice in order to compartmentalize. Anyway. We have ways to to enable ourselves to develop in different in different parts and run faster, but really consider the risk and consider what we're trying to protect, and add the friction, if you will, over time. We probably will have to design for it upfront because it's really difficult. To put the controls after the fact. But there's definitely a lot of flexibility in terms of okay, how much you're putting in there. In terms of what you need to protect. And then lastly, and this is something maybe like a cry to the partner, to the vendor community, because I talk to a lot of companies, more established startups or whatnot, and a lot of them are coming and they're presenting something that I think it's a misunderstanding of, again, going back to the process, of how the process works. I hear a lot of vendors telling me, we give tools, we give the CISO visibility. And I always answer myself so that what? What do I do with that visibility, right? And it's always, it's implied that, hey, the CISO is sitting in this chair, having these 7 screens in front of them. They look like all the different telemetry and different things. And every time they see something pops, that means somebody misbehaves. They take the big cloud from behind their chair, they walk to that person, they bang him over the head, and then the person starts behaving again. That's not how it works. That's not how, we use that visibility. That visibility needs to be that telemetry that enable us, to monitor our process, the efficacy of our process, the risk to our process, and enable us to make decisions throughout that process. that's where I see that connection. I know we're going to talk about tools later, but that's where the connections, where we have to think about the process this way in terms of how we enable the process and how we secure the process, as opposed to we just tightening the screws or punishing somebody or stopping something bad from happening.
Right. Yeah, there's many good ideas and threads there. I think this idea of instrumenting the process, this idea that there may be many of these apps, so the balance between standardization and then managed variants. So good thoughts all. Tyson, I know process is a pretty broad umbrella, right? You can take that in any direction in the context of the app lifecycle. But what have you seen as you've interacted with the CISOs and then their partner development teams, as you pointed out, as they try to put in place processes that bring some order to the complexity and chaos that Yaron was articulating there?
Yeah, I got some things that I like to build off of what Yaron has said, right? I'll stand on the shoulder of Yaron the giant a little bit. So I really like that processes should not be there to hinder evolution and invention and creativity, right? And there needs to be a safe place for play, and that safe place for play and experimentation needs to still have guiding principles, or what we'll call guardrails, within it, but they need to be less restrictive. The idea, though, process when we start moving into different life cycles, the idea of guardrails, I think, or guiding principles is really important, because also what Yaron said was things change very quickly, right? And the problem with processes is we need to have processes, but they are very dependent upon the technology a lot of times. And there's a spirit of minimal viable, security or compliance or whatever we want to put that we need to have, right? In the world of architecture, if I build a bridge, right, it could be the Golden Gate Bridge or it could be a bridge across a puddle, right? As an architect, I would follow similar principles, right? And no matter how the material science changes, the principles change a little bit as material science changes and it evolves. But I think we need to start to look at, in the past, multiple times been a CISO, right? And everywhere I went, I felt like we either didn't have any principles or we kind of made our own. And what I think is really important is that we have a guiding principles document as an organization that says, hey, as things change and evolve, these are our expectations, right? And Yaron mentioned some great things that we would be a part of that, and then there could be other things, right? How are we doing from a highly available architecture perspective? What are we doing from a secure, communication and perspective? How are we applying the principles of OWASP to the development of an application, right? No matter what we're doing, and so this is not easy. This requires an investment, and then requires a return. There's a return on that investment, but it includes anything. Like if you buy a car, you have to maintain it, right? And it requires a maintenance. So that process is very, very, very important, and it will make it so when something new comes up, if your processes are designed properly, that you want to explore and do, if you build them properly, it can be minutes or hours between when you come up with the idea until when you can roll with it in production, instead of it being days, weeks, or months, right?
It makes total sense. Your thought that...
Dave, sorry, if I may.
Go ahead, Yaron.
Sorry if I may. I want to just expand on one point that Tyson made with it. I think it's extremely, extremely important. It's those guiding principles. I think this is something as an industry overall, this is something we need to do better at. I mean, there's a lot of good pockets and a lot of things like Tyson mentioned, OWASP, and some other things. I think one of the challenges we have today as an industry, as the security industry, we don't have the kind of the generally accepted, security practices, right, or concepts. I mean, you talk to finance people, there's the GAAP rules, right, the generally accepted accounting principles, right? We don't have those for security, and I think this is oftentimes where we're falling. So I really want to emphasize what Tyson said about principles, because I think that's critical for our industry to have a set of principles. I know we have many frameworks, but to have a set of principles that are acceptable across the board that will guide, management of risk and management of security.
I love that idea that the framework is a first step, but in order to actually apply the framework in the real world, you need some higher level guiding principles behind it. So that's great. We turn to technology last, right, by design, right? Because I think oftentimes, especially in a context of, vendors and products and all of that, that tends to be first. But, I think the people, the process, and then the why and the risk management actually rightly come before. But we should touch now on the technologies as you see them. How are they evolving to help customers with this problem of securing their modern apps? What are some gaps and needs that you see? And obviously at Sumo Logic, we are in the middle of all of this kind of tool sprawl, trying to figure out how to aggregate and provide insight and clarity, so you can answer this question of how secure is your app. But I'm just curious, as you reflect on your own experiences from the technology side, and what advice would you have, to Sumo as a vendor and to the industry in terms of technology? Tyson, we can start with you on this last one.
Awesome, thank you. So I really like finding technologies that help to stitch together and make possible everything that we've talked about prior to technologies, right? So if a technology can bring value to across the business to as many business units as possible, and we can just start with the technology and development type of folks, what value is it bringing? That moves it up in the list of value, right? And then if we look at business goals, how well does it help me to accomplish those business goals? Can I creatively look at something that collects logs and then use those logs in a really intelligent way to bring additional value to a business, right? I think we look at, because we can be siloed, we look at it from our own perspective, right? And so our tools then become enabling resources for our own teams. They do not enable as many people as they should in an organization. And this is where we get to be magicians, right? This is like Yaron and I can, we can wow and wonder people, right? As we step into the box, and then when it gets open, we disappear, right? That's really what these tools can allow us to do if they're done properly. And if we look at things like, like we can talk about frameworks, right? What elements of frameworks does it check off, right? Nothing will check off all the boxes, but the more it does, and then the more value it brings to other people in what their versions of our frameworks are from a cybersecurity perspective. If it's identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover, how many things do they check off in those elements, right? That can be very powerful. That is a force multiplier, is what our tools should be, right? And I think that's what we need to aim for.
Oh, that's great. This sense of, yes, the tech then reaches up into the process and up into the people, to get breadth of impact in the process, and then collaboration with the people. That's good stuff. Yaron, how about you? Will give you the last word here.
Yeah, I completely agree about creating standards and shared capabilities. So the more capabilities we can use across and use them as a standard enterprise capability that can be used across various teams, in my opinion, the better we are. I know it's not easy to do, and there are all flavors, and everybody have their own, kind of favorite tools or whatnot. But like everything else, it's the 80-20 rule, right? And the way I think about it is, for me, the collection of those tools together is creating kind of the modern cockpit for the organization. If we reflect back on, you walk into a cockpit of a commercial airliner, 30, 40 years ago, you have 5 people in the cockpit. You have captain, first officer, you have the flight engineer, you have communication, you have navigation. And then you have all those buttons and gauges and a lot of different things. It looks like very, very complex. And everybody is kind of focused, on their own corner, and they fly the plane, right? And you walk into a cockpit these days, you have captain, first officer, and 4 monitors, and that's it. The plane flies itself for the most part. The pilots see all the critical information they need to see, like direction, altitude, speed, things like that. And if something is not a danger or something is not a problem, they may not see it at that point. I mean, just only going to jump in front of them when it's actually they need to do something about it. And I think that's where we ultimately, when we talk about these tools, when we bring the teams together and bring the tools together, that's the mindset we would like to have. It's like, how do you, number one, help me or help us fly the plane? And number two, help us prioritize what are the things that, we need to deal with. If there's a storm over the Atlantic, 1,500 miles away from me, it's interesting, but not right now. Right now, I have other things that I have to worry about because I'm flying over mountains and I want to make sure I'm not too close to the mountain, right? But when we have a lot of tools today and we get flooded with all the information at once, with all of it, it's really, really difficult for us to make sense and make the right decisions, as opposed to just catching like squirrel moments and just kind of chasing different things at different times, because that may seem to be like the most crazy or the most thing important at the moment, but you're over flooded. You're like, okay, you have to ask yourself, is it really the one thing I have to focus on right now, or I'm still 1,500 miles away from the storm? So that's how I think on daily, I want to bring the thought about like putting the tools together.
It's a great kind of image to capture this tool sprawl across, build, deploy, and run. And, a great call to action that what we really need is to synthesize the output of all of these tools, in a way that's consumable and that's tied to workflow and that enables, Tyson, as you said, the collaboration on the people side of it as well. And that's our next kind of phase of evolution of, trying to better secure these modern apps that are driving modern business. Thank you guys very much. This has been a fantastic discussion. We really appreciate you spending time with us as industry and thought leaders participating in Sumo Logic's Illuminate user conference. It's been a great discussion. Look forward to continuing that discussion with both of you in the days ahead. With that, this brings our CISO panel on securing modern applications to a close. I want to thank again Yaron Levi, CISO of Dolby, Tyson Martin, member of the CISO group at AWS, for their great contribution and participation. Thank you very much and enjoy the rest of the show.